In the autumn of 1939, German intelligence analysts in Berlin reviewed the official order of battle for the United States Army. The numbers were almost comical. The entire American ground force consisted of fewer than 190,000 men, numerically smaller than the standing army of Portugal. To the German High Command, this hard data proved an undeniable reality. America was a disorganized nation of businessmen, fundamentally incapable of projecting mechanized military force across an ocean. They had the statistical proof of American isolationism sitting right on their desks. Any potential intervention would take years to organize, arriving far too late to affect the war in Europe. But that statistical certainty would result in one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures of the Second World War. This is a forensic investigation into that fatal miscalculation. We will examine how German analysts evaluated military potential using deeply outdated metrics. They measured strength strictly through the lens of traditional martial culture, looking for aristocratic officer lineages, rigid peacetime discipline, and an ingrained warrior ethos. By relying on these archaic standards, Berlin completely ignored the raw industrial and logistical mechanics that were about to redefine modern warfare. The German military expected a traditional clash of warrior societies. They failed to realize that the United States viewed global conflict not as a test of spirit, but as a massive, brutal problem of industrial engineering. How did a seemingly unready nation of manufacturers dismantle the core strategic assumptions of the Wehrmacht? And why did the High Command stubbornly refuse to acknowledge this analytical error until their own armies were already being pulverized? To comprehend this fatal miscalculation, we have to look inside the German General Staff, an institution deeply anchored in centuries of Prussian military tradition. For the strategic planners in Berlin, military strength was not simply a matter of counting factories or measuring economic potential. It was an organic cultural phenomenon. They evaluated national power through a strict set of criteria: the historical lineage of the professional officer corps, the presence of universal peacetime conscription, and a society fundamentally organized around martial discipline. In the German view, effective armies were forged over generations of societal conditioning, not printed on an assembly line. When the intelligence branch, known as Fremde Heere West, Foreign Armies West, turned its analytical gaze toward the United States in the late 1930s, they saw a nation that violated every core principle of this Prussian framework. Declassified intelligence summaries from this period paint a clear picture of German institutional blindness. The Americans were documented as a fractured, hyper-individualistic society driven entirely by commerce and profit, not civic duty. Their civilian leadership actively distrusted a large standing military, actively debating isolationist policies in a chaotic, unmanaged press. Pre-war data highlighted that American troops were scattered across remote outposts, possessing no cohesive, modernized armored doctrine. To a seasoned staff officer in Berlin, a nation that prioritized consumer goods over munitions could never withstand the psychological shock of mechanized warfare. But this assessment was not driven by pure arrogance alone. It was supported by cold, seemingly rational logistical calculations. The analysts of Fremde Heere West were operating under the immense strategic pressure of securing a rapid victory in Europe before a prolonged war of attrition could take hold. They had to evaluate not just if America could eventually raise an army, but if it could actually deploy one against German forces in time to matter. Here, the intelligence apparatus leaned heavily on naval mathematics. They calculated the precise shipping tonnage required to supply a single motorized division across 3,000 miles of open ocean. They cross-referenced these heavy logistical demands with the anticipated sinking rates of Admiral Karl Donitz's U-boat fleets operating in the North Atlantic. The resulting reports provided the German High Command with exactly the conclusions they needed to hear to justify their aggressive timelines. The mathematical models dictated that a transatlantic deployment of a cohesive American fighting force was practically impossible. The supply bottlenecks at vital ports would be insurmountable. The U-boats would choke off the transport vessels long before they reached friendly shores. And even in the highly unlikely event that American troops managed to establish a logistical foothold, German doctrine confidently held that hastily trained civilian draftees, commanded by amateur officers, would instantly collapse when confronted by the veteran panzer divisions of the Wehrmacht. This was not merely a propaganda talking point generated for the public. It was the official operational baseline guiding the highest levels of the command structure. The fatal flaw in this logic lay in its rigid, culturally biased definitions. By measuring the Americans exclusively against a 19th century European model of warfare, the German intelligence network completely failed to recognize the terrifying potential of 20th century industrial mobilization. They saw a nation of shopkeepers and failed to understand that modern war was evolving into a brutal business of mass production, standardization, and unparalleled logistical engineering. Berlin firmly anchored its grand strategy on the absolute certainty that the Americans would not survive a real battlefield. They were entirely confident that this fragmented, civilian-led republic would shatter upon its first encounter with a genuine military machine. And as the United States prepared to deploy its untested army on the fringes of the European theater, this profound German illusion initially seemed completely, undeniably validated in the harsh deserts of North Africa. In February 1943, at the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, that German illusion became a bloody reality when the untested American Second Corps collided with the veteran panzer divisions of the Afrika Corps. The result was a catastrophic rout. The Americans were outmaneuvered, their communications broke down, and Green infantry abandoned their equipment in the desert. Suffering over 6,000 casualties, the United States Army seemed to perform exactly as Berlin had predicted. German commanders observing the chaotic retreat felt their pre-war bias was perfectly validated. These civilian draftees were soft, paralyzed by mechanized shock, and fundamentally incapable of standing their ground. But the Wehrmacht failed to understand what happened next. The American military apparatus treated the disaster at Kasserine not as a fatal blow to martial honor, but as a brutal engineering failure. They immediately began fixing the machine. Incompetent commanders were ruthlessly purged. Doctrine was rewritten on the fly, and shattered units were rapidly re-equipped from a bottomless industrial supply chain. Just weeks later, in late March 1943, the elite German 10th Panzer Division charged into the valley of El Guitar, fully expecting another easy American collapse. Instead, they hit a reinforced wall. When the panzers advanced, the Americans unleashed a terrifying tactical innovation, the time-on-target artillery barrage. Utilizing decentralized radio networks and precise mathematical synchronization, American fire direction centers calculated the varying flight times of shells fired from widely scattered batteries. The result was devastating. Hundreds of heavy artillery rounds from completely different positions arced through the sky to impact the advancing German armor at the exact same millisecond. The German counterattack was instantly pulverized under a synchronized storm of high explosives, forcing the veteran panzers into a chaotic retreat. El Guitar was a violent structural shock to the Wehrmacht. It provided the first undeniable evidence that this supposedly unready enemy could learn from its own blood in real time, triggering a rapid, lethal evolution that would soon dismantle German expectations across every operational layer. That tremor at El Guitar was just the first warning sign of a much larger, systemic earthquake. The Wehrmacht's operational models, built on decades of European military tradition, assumed that any army suffering the catastrophic losses the Americans had endured at Kasserine Pass would require months, if not a full year, to properly reconstitute. The Germans calculated refitting timelines based on their own highly specialized, almost artisanal military-industrial complex. When a German panzer division was mauled on the steppes of Russia or in the deserts of North Africa, rebuilding its strength involved complex scheduling, specialized rail transport, and careful allocation from limited, highly stressed factory runs. But the American recovery completely bypassed this expected multi-year lag, operating on a frequency the German intelligence apparatus simply could not decode. The United States did not carefully rebuild shattered divisions. They replaced them through a relentless, brutally standardized pipeline. Back in Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland, civilian factories that had been stamping out sedans, refrigerators, and heavy agricultural equipment just months prior had been wholly consumed by the War Production Board. The Germans had looked at American consumer capitalism and seen a critical civic weakness, a society too distracted by comfort to wage a total war. They failed to realize that the vast infrastructure of mass consumerism, the interstate supply chains, the obsession with standardized parts, the relentless optimization of the assembly line was the exact machinery required for mechanized global conflict. A German factory produced a tank as an integrated, bespoke weapon of war, requiring specialized mechanics to maintain. An American factory produced the M4 Sherman as an interchangeable commodity. When a German Panzer IV was destroyed, its loss was felt all the way back to the production quotas in the Ruhr Valley. When an American Sherman burned out in the desert, its loss was barely a statistical blip. Its replacement was already rolling off a Liberty cargo ship, driven by a teenage quartermaster, and delivered to the frontline unit within a matter of days. To the German intelligence officers who were desperately tracking shipping tonnages and production estimates, this velocity of replacement was physically impossible. They possessed no analytical framework to measure an enemy whose logistical reserves were, for all practical battlefield purposes, infinite. But this overwhelming industrial mass was not deployed merely as a blunt, disorganized instrument. It was heavily weaponized through a highly centralized, ruthlessly efficient framework of firepower that deeply alarmed German veterans. The time-on-target barrages pioneered in the North African campaign were rapidly refined into a continent-spanning system of localized lethality. The American military introduced the Fire Direction Center, a tactical innovation that operated much like a Wall Street clearinghouse, but trading in high explosives rather than stocks. Rather than each artillery battery firing only at targets they could physically see, the Fire Direction Center centralized the communication of an entire division. A single forward observer, equipped with a portable radio, could call in coordinates, and within minutes, the center would mathematically route that request to every available gun in the sector, regardless of their physical location. To the veteran German infantrymen, many of whom had survived the most apocalyptic meat grinders of the Eastern Front, the American artillery network was a completely different, terrifying species of warfare. The Soviets relied on massive, pre-planned bombardments that pulverized grid squares over hours or days, allowing troops to hunker down in deep bunkers and wait out the storm. The Americans, however, possessed a terrifying, instantaneous precision. A German patrol could make contact with an American forward element, and within 3 minutes, hundreds of heavy artillery rounds from completely different map coordinates would arc through the sky to impact their exact position at the exact same millisecond. This localized lethality was magnified to horrific proportions with the introduction of one of the most closely guarded technological secrets of the war, the VT, or proximity fuse. Before this innovation, artillery shells had to be manually fused to detonate, either on physical impact or via a mechanical timer, both of which left wide margins for error. The American proximity fuse contained a miniaturized radar transmitter that constantly bounced radio waves off the approaching ground, calculating the Doppler shift to detonate the shell at the exact optimal height of 50 feet in the air. This technology turned the sky above the German lines into a canopy of lethal fragmentation. Foxholes, trenches, and defilades, the traditional lifesavers of the infantrymen for centuries, were rendered suddenly useless against deadly, inescapable airbursts. German prisoners of war repeatedly expressed profound psychological shock, not just at the sheer, deafening volume of American fire, but at its inescapable mechanics. They were being systematically dismantled from the air by an enemy they could not even see, using technology that German engineers had deemed too fragile to fire out of a cannon. By the summer of 1944, following the bloody breakout from the Normandy beachheads, the Wehrmacht encountered the next terrifying phase of American industrial warfare: logistical elasticity. As the German armies retreated across France in disarray, the High Command in Berlin expected the Allied advance to naturally stall out. Classical military doctrine and the Wehrmacht's own bitter experience in the vastness of the Soviet Union dictated that an advancing army inevitably outruns its supply lines. An armored spearhead can only travel as far as its fuel trucks can reach. The German logistical network was still heavily, almost desperately reliant on the Reichsbahn railway system and hundreds of thousands of slow, horse-drawn wagons. They operated under the ironclad assumption that moving millions of gallons of aviation fuel, diesel, and tons of heavy ammunition across hundreds of miles of bombed-out infrastructure was a physical impossibility. The American response to this geographic constraint was the Red Ball Express. It was a massive, improvised trucking operation that effectively paved a continuous, high-speed conveyor belt over the ruined, cratered roads of northern France. Nearly 6,000 2.5-ton trucks were mobilized, operating day and night in a relentless, continuous loop that bypassed the destroyed European rail hubs entirely. Driven largely by segregated African-American quartermaster units working 75-hour shifts to the point of sheer exhaustion, these convoys moved over 400,000 tons of vital supplies at a pace the German High Command could not comprehend. Special military police units locked down civilian roads, turning them into strictly controlled, one-way military highways marked with glowing red dots. Vehicles drove at night with restricted blackout lights, nose to tail, strictly forbidden from stopping. When German reconnaissance pilots flew dangerous sorties over the Allied rear echelons, they did not see a vulnerable, overextended supply line slowly stretching to its breaking point. They saw bumper-to-bumper rivers of gasoline, ammunition, and medical supplies flowing forward at 40 miles an hour. The Americans had industrialized the very concept of military pursuit, completely rewriting the math of operational reach. On the ground in France, this reality forced a profound paradigm shift among the German frontline commanders. Men like Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and Field Marshal Gerd von Hundstedt, commanders steeped in the aristocratic Prussian tradition of maneuver warfare, found themselves staring at maps bleeding red with expanding American penetrations. They began sending a series of increasingly frantic, heavily detailed reports back to the High Command in Berlin. Rommel's assessments, stripped of all pre-war arrogance, bluntly warned that the Wehrmacht was facing an overwhelming material superiority that rendered traditional tactical genius entirely irrelevant. But more alarmingly, these frontline generals noted a disturbing tactical flexibility in the American ranks. The Americans were not simply brute forcing their way forward with mindless mass. They were actively, continuously adapting. When an American infantry column hit a fortified German strongpoint, they did not waste human lives in rigid, glorious frontal assaults like the Soviet penal battalions or the zealous, ideologically driven Waffen-SS. Instead, the Americans stopped, pulled back slightly out of range, and picked up a radio. Within minutes, that strongpoint would be erased from the map by a swarm of tactical fighter bombers or pinpoint artillery strikes, and the armored column would simply drive over the smoking rubble. To the frontline German generals desperately trying to hold the line, this methodology was not cowardice. It was a terrifyingly methodical, highly adaptive system of total destruction. They realized, with growing dread, that the Wehrmacht was bleeding its irreplaceable veteran manpower, while the Americans were merely expending mass-produced steel. Yet, inside the insulated bunkers of the High Command in Berlin, this desperate reality was met with stubborn, delusional dismissal. How did the central nervous system of the German military process the urgent warnings from its most experienced field marshals? By flatly rejecting them. Adolf Hitler, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, and General Alfred Jodl refused to update their pre-war intelligence paradigm. The cognitive dissonance was simply too great. To accept Rommel's bleak assessment meant acknowledging that their entire philosophical foundation of war, the fascist belief in the absolute supremacy of the warrior spirit over material reality, was a catastrophic fraud. Instead, Berlin's intelligence analysts actively warped the incoming data to fit their preconceived cultural biases. When they read field reports of American units pausing their advance to call in heavy artillery, rather than charging machine gun nests with bayonets, the High Command did not see tactical efficiency. They declared it definitive proof of moral weakness. The official consensus in Berlin hardened into a comforting, fatal lie. The Americans were cowardly troops, afraid of hand-to-hand combat, hiding behind an excessive wall of machinery. The German command convinced themselves that this enemy was soft, inherently dependent on fair weather for their airplanes and solid roads for their trucks. They reasoned that if the Wehrmacht could just strip away this technological shield, if they could force the Americans into a brutal, close-quarters infantry slugfest in the mud, the snow, or the dark, where machines could not save them, this fragile army of businessmen would immediately shatter and beg for terms. This ideological blindness set the stage for one of the greatest intelligence disasters of the 20th century. The German High Command was entirely correct that the American soldier relied heavily on technology, logistics, and overwhelming firepower. But they were entirely wrong about what that reliance actually meant. Because the true American advantage, the one factor that finally broke the German military machine, was not just their overwhelming industrial mass, but a hidden cultural strength the Germans entirely failed to measure. That hidden strength was the fundamentally decentralized nature of the American mind. The German military operated under the strict assumption that an enemy force, if deprived of its communications and senior leadership, would instantly paralyze into static, helpless pockets. They believed modern armies were fragile hierarchies. This theory was put to the ultimate test in June 1944. During the chaotic airborne drops over Normandy and the claustrophobic nightmare of the French hedgerow country. When American paratroopers were scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula, with radios lost and commanders missing in the dark, the High Command expected them to freeze. Instead, German patrols encountered something deeply unnatural to their doctrine. American junior officers, non-commissioned officers, and even privates instinctively abandoned their original plans. They formed ad hoc combat groups, grabbing whoever was nearby, and began solving immediate tactical problems on the fly. This was the lethal application of American civilian culture on the battlefield. These young men had been construction foremen, auto mechanics, and floor managers before the war. They were raised in a society that rewarded independent troubleshooting over rigid obedience to protocol. If a Sherman tank was trapped behind a massive earthen hedgerow, a farm boy and a welder would simply salvage scrap steel from beach obstacles and weld it to the hull to rip through the roots. They improvised relentlessly. The rigid German command structure could not compute an enemy that seemed to fight better when the textbook plan completely fell apart. Yet the architects in Berlin still refused to accept this reality. They convinced themselves this decentralized resilience was merely a fluke, setting the stage for the ultimate collision of these two opposing worldviews, a final desperate trap engineered by Hitler himself in the freezing forests of the Ardennes. In December 1944, Hitler launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, staking the survival of the Third Reich on that fatally flawed 1939 intelligence assessment. Under the cover of severe winter storms that grounded American air power, massive German armored columns slammed into a thinly held sector of the Ardennes. The strategic objective was Antwerp, but the primary psychological target was the American mind. Hitler explicitly calculated that a sudden, violently concentrated shock in the freezing snow would trigger mass panic among the supposedly soft civilian soldiers, permanently fracturing the Allied coalition. As the German spearheads plunged deeper, however, they encountered a structural reality their doctrine could not explain. The Americans did not simply scatter and collapse. Instead, isolated detachments, cut off from higher command, instinctively formed defensive perimeters around vital road junctions. At Bastogne, surrounded paratroopers of the 101st Airborne and fragments of the 10th Armored Division found themselves completely encircled, freezing, and outgunned by converging panzer divisions. Yet they anchored themselves to the crossroads, fighting a brutal, decentralized defense that fatally disrupted the strict timetables of the German advance. Then, the Wehrmacht was hit by a logistical counterpunch that defied classical military mathematics. Over 100 miles to the south, General George S. Patton executed a maneuver that German staff officers considered physically impossible. In the middle of a brutal winter, Patton abruptly halted the eastward offensive of his Third Army, pivoted hundreds of thousands of men, tanks, and supply vehicles 90 degrees, and launched a massive, coordinated counterattack into the German flank in just under 3 days. It was an unprecedented feat of staff engineering, wholly reliant on motorized infantry, an endless fleet of trucks, and standardized supply chains operating at maximum velocity. The Ardennes offensive did not fail merely because of isolated bravery in the snow. It collapsed because the German High Command was still fighting a theoretical war of 19th century morale. They had expected a brittle army that would snap under pressure, but instead collided with a highly adaptive, industrialized network that could absorb a massive shock, instantly reroute its resources, and strike back with overwhelming mechanical force. As the Third Reich was systematically dismantled by this very network, the intelligence analysts in Berlin, who had first evaluated the United States Army in 1939, were left with a devastating realization. The profound, tragic irony of their failure was not that their original data was wrong. In fact, their baseline statistics had been perfectly accurate. America truly was a nation of civilian managers, assembly line engineers, and factory workers, completely devoid of the deeply ingrained martial culture that defined the Prussian tradition. The fatal, empire-ending error of the German High Command was never in misreading the American character. Their catastrophic failure lay in misreading the evolving nature of war itself. They remained hopelessly trapped in a 19th century philosophical framework, blindly believing that global conflict would ultimately be decided by cultural discipline and pure warrior spirit. They possessed the exact logistical math required to understand the threat, yet stubbornly interpreted it through an archaic, arrogant lens. They completely failed to recognize that the criteria for national lethality had irrevocably shifted. War was no longer a romanticized contest of ideological zeal. It had mutated into a brutally complex, mechanized problem of mass production, supply chain management, and sheer material attrition. The ultimate lesson of the Western Front was not merely that the German intelligence apparatus was outproduced, but that the United States had fundamentally redefined the mechanical physics of modern victory. The Americans did not defeat the Wehrmacht by learning to become traditional warriors. They defeated them by turning war into a highly efficient, rapidly adaptive industry. The supposed nation of shopkeepers simply built a factory of destruction that the old European empires could not comprehend.